Okay, today's class is offered to the general public by the BYU Family History Library. Our presenter is Kathryn Grant. Sister Grant, as many of you who are return customers, so to speak, has a deep knowledge and understanding of of genealogy and a passion for it, and is a very good presenter in that she can teach us what she knows. In a way that we can understand. And we're happy to have her today. And you're looking for a real treat on this particular subject, which is can be a very challenging one for someone who is even a skilled genealogist. I'll now time the term over to Sister Grant.
Thank you so much, Elder Esplin, and thanks for your kind introduction. I am just going to share my screen over here really quickly. Okay, you guys should be able to see my screen. If not, please post a note in the chat. So now I want to go full screen so we've got enough room. There we go. So everybody, welcome to our class today. This class is a little bit of a departure from our previous classes. Most of my previous classes have focused on using Family Search's family tree. This one actually focuses on a tool that you can use to help you with your research. So those of you who have been doing any kind of research for any length of time probably are familiar with this challenge. When you do research, how do you record your findings so that they're easy to organize and to use? I don't know if any of you have had this experience, but I know sometimes when I've had to take a break from family history, maybe for family reasons or whatever, and I don't do it for a couple of weeks and I come back, let's see, where was I? Oh yeah, I was working on the Bescabee family. I think it was Thomas, and dig back in and do it. And after about a half hour goes by, I have this strange sense of deja vu that I've just repeated a bunch of the same stuff that I've done before. So if any of you have had that kind of challenge or just challenges remembering or keeping track of your research, one answer to doing that may be the timeline grid that we're going to talk about today. So here's an overview of what we got on the schedule. 4 items. First of all, what is the timeline grid to get us all on the same page? How do I use it? How can it help me? And how do I get started? So what is the timeline grid? It is a table that you create or copy from a template. And to keep a promise to a friend of mine, I need to specify right up front. So I have to practice my presentations or I can't do a good job. Like I have to rehearse them. And it helps if I can rehearse it to a real person. So I cornered a friend of mine and she graciously agreed to listen to me practice this presentation on her. This is a couple years ago. So I practiced it and got to the end and she said, "Well, that was nice. How much do I owe you?" And I'm like, "Stacy, what owe me? No, you don't have to pay me to listen to my presentation." And she said, "No, how much do I owe you for the timeline grid?" And I said, no, this is totally free. This has nothing to do with paying any money ever. There's no premium version of it or whatever. It's just free. It's just a tool." And she said, "Well, you better tell people that." So bless her heart, she sat through my whole presentation thinking I was doing a bait and switch on her and that I was going to explain this wonderful tool and then at the end say, "And now you owe me $99.95. No, this is just, it's so simple, you guys. Anybody, in fact, we're going to later talk about the different ways that you can create a timeline grid. Like you can use Microsoft Word, you can use Excel, you can use Google Docs, et cetera, et cetera. So free, there will never be any cost to it. So now I've fulfilled my obligation to my friend Stacy to tell you that up front. So it is a table that you create, or you can copy it from a template if you, hopefully that would save you a little bit of time. And it centers on one family, parents and children. I used to try to do multiple generations in one grid, and it just turned into a bowl of spaghetti. It was just a mess. So now I create one grid for each family instead of trying to do multiple families in a grid. It's most useful in countries and time periods with regular censuses. I have thrown in columns for immigration and so forth, but mostly it's going to help you as a research tool in an area and country, or excuse me, area and time period that use census records. Finally, in a nutshell, it shows key family information in an organized and compact space, and that is its genius in helping you be productive as a researcher. So those words all might sound really good, but pictures are worth a lot more. I find that it's much more helpful to me to see examples than to hear someone only explain it. Excuse me. So we will go ahead and walk through some examples. So here on your screen, you see a timeline grid. This one is for England. So it has the censuses. Well, I'm getting ahead of myself actually. The first column I use for identification and for vitals. So I will put the person's name and I'll put the family search PID if they have one, that little 7-digit identifier. And I'll also put birth, marriage, death, sometimes military information, any kind of one-time event for that person. And then there's a column for every census that you expect to find that person in. And then finally, every person gets their own row. So what does that look like? Well, here is a sample. I'm going to do a timeline grid for Ann Gunton on my family line and her husband, Thomas Guy, and their children. So I start by putting the name of the parents or the couple at the top of the grid. And you notice that I've got a date by Ann's, which is 1839. Well, bless the Guntons' hearts, like many other families that I'm sure you can all relate to, they just kept using the same names over and over. So I have a bazillion Ann Guntons on my line. So by putting the date in, I can quickly distinguish, okay, this isn't the one from the 1890s or the 1910s or whatever. It's Ann back in 1839. And of course, the relationships help establish context too. And then I didn't used to do this, but I found that it helped so much that I started doing it. And that is to put the parents of my ancestor. So Anne is my person, and Thomas he married into our family. So I didn't put his parents, although there's no reason why you couldn't. Somebody asked that in a previous class. And yeah, if you felt it would be helpful, absolutely. That's the great thing about the timeline grid. It's so completely flexible and adaptable to meet your needs. So for me, I just wanted to put the parents of the person I was related to, so I put them right under the couple. And then you just start filling in the gaps. So, for instance, I found the 1871 census for this family. So, here is a screenshot of it at the bottom of the screen. They're living at a place called Dyke Moon. And here's Thomas Guy. He's the head. He's 38. He's a farmer, et cetera, et cetera. There's his wife, Anne. There's their son, William. So this is how I would put them in the timeline grid. First of all, I put the enumeration information at the top. So, and there's, sorry, there wasn't room to put it here, but you know how at the top of a digitized census, almost always, like I can't think of any time they don't do this, they'll list the district, the parish or the city or whatever where it was enumerated, the county, um, and the residents. And so I've captured that information up here. And so I just type it. You see, it's nothing fancy. It's just the table is just a table that you type into. So I just type District 11, comma, Doddington, comma, and just put in the information that I need. And then I start doing the same thing with the family members. So Thomas Guy, he's the head of the household. He's married. He's 38. He's the farmer of 16 acres. He was born in Maney, Cambridgeshire. Then I do the same thing for Anne, and I do the same thing for William. And at this point in the census, they've only got one child. But as their family grows, as I find them in future censuses, then of course I make a row for each one of those other children. So then usually I find that I do start with a census And once I have got kind of rows assigned to people, then I'll put their names out here in the first column so that I can easily identify which row is for which person. So we've got Thomas, and I put women by their maiden surnames because that's what Family Search and other genealogy sites and programs use in order to avoid confusion with women's names, since many women, or excuse me, women in many cultures change their name when they marry. Then it avoids confusion to use their birth surname or their maiden surname when doing family history. So that's what I've done here. And then, of course, the name of their child. Now, as a convenience, you can add the birth year right under the name. And I like to do that because it is often used for searching. So I can immediately come in here and say, Thomas Guy, 1833, that's what I'm going to put in my search parameters. And then you just keep adding information as you find it. So this is one thing I love about the grid. Have you guys noticed when you research, you rarely find information in chronological order? So I found the 1891 census before I found the 81, but since there's a spot for it on the grid, very easy to plug that information in. So I just followed the same process that we looked at just a moment ago and put in that information for that census. And then here I found some birth information. So I added that in the, added it for Anne and added it for William. And fast forward to a completed grid, kind of when you watch those cooking shows, and they take the completed thing out of the oven after 2 seconds of being in the oven. That's what we're doing here. So here's a completed grid. And you see that I've just gone through and added all the information from the censuses that I could find, all the birth information and so forth. I am going to guess that some of you are looking at this and having questions because they've come up in previous classes. So I thought I would address some of those questions right up front. One is, what's going on with the abbreviations and what if I don't know what they are? So the reason I started using abbreviations is that these cells are pretty small, right? And if I write out a lot of stuff, it just clutters it and makes it hard to read. So I use the standard abbreviation for counties in England. Excuse me, if I'm in the United States, I use the postal abbreviations like UT for Utah, or CA for California, or GA for Georgia. Then these little abbreviations, they're kind of self-evident to a degree, although not always. I think B, probably most of us would say, oh, that means born. But then I've got a few others that I use for birth registrations. So after a while, I thought if other people are going to be using the timeline grid, we really need a legend. So we added one. So every template has a link to this legend that is stored on Google Drive, and it's open to anybody. So you actually don't have to have a Google account in order to see the legend. But here's what it looks like. So you click that, and it's just got a list of abbreviations for vital information and then abbreviations for whatever country the grid is for. And currently we have grids, I might have said this before, for the United States, for Canada, and for England. So the BR here, you can see you would just look up, what does BR mean? Oh, it means birth registration. So that's just my quick little way of saying this is an English civil birth registration. Q means quarter. You can see that down here. RD means registration district. And you can add your own abbreviations. You'd have to actually make a copy of the grid and change your links, because this master copy that I'm sharing is not editable by the general public, but you can easily make a copy and then you can add or change your abbreviations. So what about text color? That's the other question that comes up. So the reason I did different text colors here is that William is with his family when he's 1. He's also with them when he's 11. But by the time he's 21, he has moved out. But he hasn't started his own family yet. So it's not time for me to start a new grid for him because it'd just have one cell. Like, what would be the point, right? For just if he hasn't got his own family yet. Well, a little interesting side note here. Notice that he is a lodger with the Norman family. And by the 1901 census, and he's a farmer. So by the 1901 census, he has married the farmer's daughter. And I always like to imagine in my mind that Mary Jane, the woman he married, was really happy when her dad hired this cute new guy to come help out on the farm. And so I'm sure that she got to know him and they fell in love and then they started their own family. So who said family history records are boring, right? They tell stories. You just have to have eyes open to see the stories that they're telling. Okay, granted, I took a little bit of license there, but they did get married. We know that part of the story. And hopefully they were in love. So I colored here, getting back to the main point, I colored this a different color to give me a visual cue that he was not living with his family. So this enumeration information is only for William. They're both orange, and that tells me where he was, as opposed to the black is where his parents were. So I see that we've got a question in the Q&A. This is a good stopping point. So let me open that up. Oh, Elizabeth says, where do you find this legend? Elizabeth, good question. So I've created a link in all of the templates. This is clickable. And so I apologize that I didn't make that clear, but this is a clickable link that will open up the legend for you in Google Drive. And then you can either use it as it is, or you can copy it and then you can tweak your copy. And if you decide to make a copy, you would need to go back to your timeline grid and change this link to your new legend that you had created. So Elizabeth, thank you for asking that question.
Kathryn, there's also a
Yeah.
couple of comments. Do you have another grid for information other than the census?
I don't yet, and that is a great idea. I've actually tried to figure out how to do it, and for instance, England before the census relies on church records. So I've played around with tables that list christenings, marriages, and deaths. Honestly, I haven't found a structure that I really like yet. So if anybody comes up with something, I would love to hear about it. So good question.
And also, is Dyke Moon or is it Dyke Moor in the 1871?
Oh, good question. From what I read on it, it appears to me to be Dyke Moon, but I could be wrong about that. So good question. One thing about that is it's not extremely important to spend a lot of time on unless you're really curious about it, because they move. And so it's helpful to know a residence if the family lives in the same place year census after census. Like once they move to this Beesling or Beeslinger, you notice they keep naming it differently. So I'm not sure what it really is, but it's helpful here because I see, oh, I don't have it in here, but I think they were there in 1891. I got to fix that. But anyway, that's the main benefit of a residence name, is that you can kind of verify across censuses. But since they're only here in the 1871, I haven't really looked further into it. But thank you for asking that question.
So, Kathryn, somebody says, what if you've been accumulating data for years? It seems overwhelming to go back through all of the information and set up a timeline. Any suggestions?
I agree. Honestly, and I faced that myself. So what I just did is I had to draw a line in the sand and say, I'm going to use it going forward. And then if I ever revisit an old family, I might put their information into the timeline grid, but I don't think I would, especially if you've got like reams and reams of old research. I don't think I'd put all of that onto the timeline grid unless you really knew that you were going to use it, that it was going to be valuable to you. That's another really good question.
So, Kathryn, there's also
Yeah.
some questions about the timeline grid and that. I'm going to put the link right now to your Google Docs in the
Good
chat,
idea.
and then
Yeah,
we'll add it again for people who come later.
perfect. Thank you so much for doing that. Yeah, we're going to give all the links at the end to you. And also we'll give a link to this presentation so you'll have access to all this information. So you guys, thank you very much for asking that. And I'm thrilled that people are asking and want to know where the links are. So that is awesome. Okay. One trick that I found that is really useful, you can do the timeline grid on one screen or one window and keep flipping back and forth between the timeline grid and the record, but it's kind of a pain, to be honest. So if I'm on my laptop and I don't have another monitor, I'll actually resize my windows so that they're side by side, so I can see both the historical record on one side, timeline grid on the other. If I'm in a situation like at work where I have two monitors, that's actually even better. You can put the historical information on one monitor and the timeline grid on the other. And honestly, I've heard some people say that it's worth it to them, not just for the timeline grid, but for genealogy in general, to get a cheap second monitor, because you can get a really cheap monitor at, I don't know, Best Buy or Costco or different places that sell them pretty inexpensively. Maybe even you could buy one used online. Just depends on what works for you. But anyway, it is helpful to put the stuff side by side instead of having to flip back and forth between screens. So that's really it, you guys, as far as the basics of using the timeline grid. But there are some fun things that you can do with it that actually even enhance your experience. Let me see what time it is here. I don't want to go over. Okay, we're doing pretty good on time. So I wanted to go over some of the key things that kind of go beyond the basics that may be helpful to you in using the timeline grid. And here they are: hyperlinks, comments, text and background colors, which we touched on a little, to-do lists, and using collaborative features. And I'm going to focus on Google Drive since that's where I put my timeline grids, but the same principles that we're going to talk about apply to other cloud services like Dropbox, or if you're using Evernote in a cloud service, or OneNote, or any of those other types of services. So just the beauty of putting it in the cloud is that it enables you to collaborate with friends and family members. So hyperlinks. People always ask about these, and it's just so exciting to realize how simple it is to add hyperlinks to your timeline grid. So first question, what do you hyperlink? Well, I like to hyperlink other grids. So here I've got a grid for the parents, and I've got a grid for William and Mary Jane when they start their own family. And I also like to hyperlink to sources. So here I've got links to the census images, and here I've got links to the birth registrations. So then the question is, people always ask, how do you make a hyperlink? I didn't even know that was possible. So here is how. Let's walk through an example. I am on the timeline grid for my relative Eliza Bescaby and her husband John, and her parents are Thomas and Anne, and I want to link Eliza's timeline grid to Thomas and Anne's timeline grid so that I can easily jump to it whenever I need to. So this is how I would do that. First thing, I would go to Thomas and Anne's timeline grid. So here it is. Here's the little screenshot. And you click once in the address bar to select the URL, to select the web address. Now, here's the little tricky thing. Sometimes when I click in that, it's not selected. You can tell if it's selected because it will have a shaded background. But if you click in it and there's no shaded background, then here's an easy way to select the link, and you'll see it'll give a shaded background. If you're on a PC, do Control A. If you're on a Mac, do Command A. Or if you're a mouse person, just right click right on top of the link, and then you get that little pop down menu. You would just choose Select All, and that will select the link. Bottom line is you got to select the link, because the next step is you copy it. And here are the options for copying depending on your preference. There's different ways to do it. So once you've copied it, it stores the link in the computer's short-term memory, as it were. So then we go back over to the document where we wanted to create the link. So back to Eliza's timeline grid, and we select the text that we want to turn into a link. And I usually just do it by dragging my mouse over it. But for those of you who like keyboards, I don't know if you knew of this. Someone told me about it like a while ago, and I thought it was a really cool trick. If you click at the place where you want to start the link, and this works on PC and Mac, and so click at the beginning of the link. So I'd click in front of the T of Thomas. then hold down your shift key on the keyboard, then you can actually use your arrow keys to select text. So that's just a cool little tip. So but probably I'm going to use my mouse, honestly. So I'm going to cover up the text. I'm going to select it by dragging my mouse cursor over it. And then I press Control K on the PC or Command K on the Mac, or you can do this little right click thing and select link, and you get a pop-up box that looks like this. Well, in this box right here, you paste the link that you copied. So the way you can paste it is by these keystrokes or these right clicks. And then once you've copied the link in, you click apply, and it turns it into a link that you can use to jump to that document. So how cool is that, right? So now you know how to make a hyperlink if you did not know how before. And a very similar process works in word processing programs such as Microsoft Word. Okay, that's how you did hyperlinks. Now let's talk about comments. I like using comments to capture my questions, to call out discrepancies, or even negative search results. If you're wondering what a negative search result is, it's when you look but you don't find anything. Well, it's helpful to know that you didn't find anything. So you can use a comment to capture, I searched the military records and I could not find a draft registration or whatever it may be that you were looking for. So how do you add a comment? It's actually very similar to adding a hyperlink. The principle is very similar. So first of all, you select the text that you want to attach the comment to. And now in Google Drive, this is a relatively new feature. I don't know, maybe within the last 6 months or something. But now, as soon as you select text, you're going to get this little pop-up menu. And the first item is creating a comment. So you can either click that, and frankly, that's probably the easiest way to do it, or you've got these other options, and I won't walk through them, but they're here in the instructions if you prefer to do those. And once you've done that, you get a little box come up, and it's a place where you can type your comment. And then once you've typed your comment, you click comment. And I think in Microsoft Word, it might be something like, oh, you know what? I think in Microsoft Word, if I'm remembering right, you actually just click outside the comment box to save the comment. I'm trying to remember if it even has a button for saving. Maybe somebody could check that out, or if you remember, post it in the chat, because I honestly use Google way more than I use Microsoft Word. So I don't remember exactly how their interface is. But anyway, in Google Docs, just click comment, and that will save your comment, and it will just show up out to the side of your timeline grid. Okay, text or background coloring. That here are examples of what you can use that for. So you can use it, as we said, to distinguish between different censuses for the same year. So if family members were enumerated in different places. And you can also use it for any number of ways to call out the text or to highlight it, make it stand out to you. So for instance, here, Anne's husband says he's a widower in 1911, but I haven't found any proof yet. And I have found censuses where a spouse lied about being a widower. They had actually left their partner. I remember one time I found absolute proof that the person had said their spouse had died, but their spouse was actually alive and they had split up. But it was back in the day where there was a huge stigma with divorce, or leaving your partner, whatever. So apparently she had not wanted to admit it to the enumerator, and I can't say I blame her. So she said her husband was dead, and actually, come to think of it, maybe she really didn't know. But I later found her husband's death certificate with one of the kids as an informant. So I kind of have to think she did know her husband was still alive and just wasn't there. So long story, long explanation to say why, if you haven't found sufficient proof to satisfy yourself, and I'm not talking about any strict standards, this is just for you. You're like, I really want to do more research on that. Then you can just put in unproven and put it in red letters, or anything else in any other color that would help you remember to do the research that you want to do. And another thing I like to do, there wasn't a lot of room on this screen, obviously, to fit in all of the kids in the family. So, but William and Mary Jane had a few other children. And so I always like to include the parents in the timeline grid for context, but it can be really confusing if you've got a set of parents here and then you've got a set of parents here. So these up here are William's parents, but this grid is really William's grid. Now you don't have to include the parents of the person, but again, as I said, I like to because it gives me context. But to avoid confusion, I will shade the background of the parents that the grid is not about, the parents that are just there for context. I hope that makes sense, you guys. If it doesn't, please ask a follow-up question. Okay, another thing I love to do in the timeline grid is put a to-do list at the top so that I remember if I have to be away from my research for a while or I move to a different family or whatever, when I come back, it's very easy to see what I have on my list of things that I want to do. There's nothing magic about this. It is a numbered list in a Google Doc or in Word or whatever. So it's not any special feature or function. You just start creating a number list. That's all there is to it. One thing I'll do is once I've finished an item, and again, this is nothing fancy, down at the bottom of the grid, I'll type the word done and I'll cut the item that I've done and I'll paste it at the bottom of the grid under done. Now, sometimes I've just jotted down something and I don't even care if I'm going to track it, like it's just not that important. So then I just delete it. But if it's something I want to remember that I've done, then very often I will cut it from up here, paste it down below, and then it's out of the way, but I've got a record of having accomplished that to-do item. Last of all, in this section, benefits of using Google Drive or a cloud service. You can access your timeline grids from multiple locations and devices. So you can access it at home. You can access it if you're visiting a family member, if you're down at the library, if you're at a family history center, if you're on the train and you're commuting and you are bored and you want to, bring up something on your phone. It's just awesome to have things in the cloud where you can access them no matter where you are, as long as you've got an internet connection. And of course, cloud services are great for collaboration because you can both be editing, working on the same timeline grid. My sisters and I do that. And it's so funny when we're both in the same grid, but not in the same location, like one person's in another city, you can actually see in Google Drive the other person typing. It's hilarious. You can also chat online with the people that you're collaborating with, and you can leave them comments as we saw. You can also search timeline grids, which is an amazing feature. Google, of course, is famous for their excellent searching. I'll give you an example of how that was useful. I had been working on a family who lived in the interesting little parish of Huff on the Hill. It's Hough, but I have to think somebody was thinking of huffing if they were climbing the hill. So I work on that family and then I move on to other things. And then a few years later, I find another family from Huff on the Hill. Do you think I can remember the first family? Nope. Been years. I did not have any memory of the family that, and I'd worked on so many people between then. So I just searched in Google Drive. There's the search box at the top of your Google Drive and immediately found every other grid that mentioned Huff on the Hill. So then I could see, oh, what are the connections between these families and, how far did they live apart? And it's just fun to know, did they know each other? Were they related? Was this actually a cousin or a sibling or whatever? And the last thing I love about Google Drive and most other cloud services is that they offer version control. Let me give you an example of when I really messed up, and that was helpful to me. So I was working on a timeline grid, and I had put some information in on a row, and then I think either it turned out the person wasn't in the family or something. Anyway, I deleted the row. Then I left it for a while and I came back, and the row was still there and the column was gone. So I didn't delete the row. I accidentally deleted a column instead. So I must have hit the wrong option in the menu or whatever. But I had totally messed up and deleted a column that I needed, that I didn't mean to delete. And meanwhile, I had the junk that I didn't want, that I wished I had deleted. Well, thanks to Google Drive, you just click on File and you go to version control and you can get back any previous version. And it tends to save them in chunks of time. Like, so it'll make a copy when you sign off, and then when you sign back in, it'll consider that a new version. So the old version will be saved, and then it'll start tracking the new one. What else was I going to say about that? If you don't want to restore the whole version, like if in this case, I did want the version back because I wanted my column back and I wanted to get rid of and then I was going to delete the row. But let's say that you've made a bunch of changes. And so you didn't want to reverse all those changes. Well, once you've opened up a version, excuse me, having trouble swallowing here. Once you've opened up a version, you can actually copy and paste old content and then go back to the current version and paste in that correct content. So you've got a lot of flexibility with version control, and it may just save your bacon if you delete something that you didn't mean to delete. Okay, this is it. We're to the end section, the last section of the webinar today. So this is actually a good time to break and take a couple of Q&As.
So Kathryn, there
So
are
yes,
a couple of comments in the chat.
yeah,
Got some great participants who are out there giving us good information. Gordon
wonderful.
says to add a comment in Word, you select the text you want to comment on or click at the end of the text. On the Review tab, click New Comment, type in your comment. Word shows your comment in balloon or in the document's margin. And then Katie says to add a comment in Excel, you right-click on the cell, select New Note, and the text is automatically saved on exit. To edit the note, you right-click to show options, edit, delete, or show and hide.
Fantastic. Thank you, you guys, for giving that information for both Word and Excel. I appreciate that. Okay, Mike is asking a question in the Q&A. He says, do you use the VRides? I'm not sure what VRides are, to write a biography, or do you just say grid on family search? What do you use the grids for? Mike, such a good question. I actually use the grids, excuse me, to prepare to enter information in Family Tree. So as probably most of you know, there's so much incorrect information in Family Tree, and I want to make sure that that I've got my information correct before I put it in there. Or if I'm trying to sort out a mess in Family Tree, I'll use a timeline grid as well. I'll make sure I've got all my information in there correctly, and then I'll go to Family Tree and I will either add the information that's missing, or I'll use my timeline grid to clean up that information. So, and I've thought about, which I'm kind of grinning because I haven't done it yet, but I've thought about how nice it would be to actually link to a grid in Family Search sources. So for a person, you could just go create a source and create a link to the timeline grid. Usually mine aren't finished, and so is that a terrible excuse? And so I haven't been putting them in because I think, oh, I'm going to wait until I get them all cleaned up and all filled out the way they need to be, and then I'll attach them as a source. And frankly, then I think I've maybe attached one as a source. So probably I need to be not so perfectionistic about it and just go ahead and attach it as a source. So that could be helpful too, Mike, to answer your question, to attach it as sources so that other people can benefit from the research that you've done. Okay, that takes care of. Oh,
I was
Sister
going to
Esplin?
mention one other thing.
Yeah.
Anne had mentioned that even having a third monitor is really helpful if you're
Yes.
looking a lot of real estate. And then there's a comment in the chat where she's saying, you know, you can pick up cheap monitors from public service and surplus
Oh,
and that. And there's links.
great.
So if people are interested in an extra monitor, this is another great resource.
Oh my goodness, I had no idea. That is a great suggestion. Yeah, honestly, at one of my jobs, I had 3 monitors and I loved it. Just again, because you can have stuff on the screen and it's visible and you don't have to keep flipping between windows. So thank you very much, Anne, for that information. Okay, let's wrap up class today by looking at a couple of ways that the timeline grid can help you in your research. So the first thing, and probably the thing that has helped me the most, you guys, is it helps me get to know my family. It gives me a snapshot of them in time. So when I'm flipping back and forth between censuses and ancestry or whatever, I can hold a certain amount of information in my head, but not as much as a grid will hold. And so, excuse me. So what I found is it is so helpful and it actually frees up my brain so that I'm not trying to think, okay, in the 1881 they were here, in the 1891 they were here, whatever. Instead, I've got it all captured. So at any time I can look at this grid and I can say, oh, they stayed in Doddington all the time until Thomas died and went to go live with his son. And then he went to the neighboring parish of March. I like to see how Thomas did on his farm. He started out being a farmer of 16 acres. 10 years later, he had 24. So his farm was growing. And I am sure that he was a diligent worker. And I just think, wow, what a great example of this man working hard to support his family and improving upon the talents and the skills that he had and growing his farm. And then I noticed that he and Anne were together throughout all the years until she died when they were both in pretty advanced years. And then, like I said, he went to go live with one of his sons. And I see that William here went and worked with his future wife's family. They fell in love, got married. I mean, it's just so cool to look at this grid and feel like now I really have a sense of my family. I know that Thomas was a farmer, and Anne listed herself as a farmer's wife, and the tradition carried on. William was a farmer too, et cetera, et cetera. It helps me feel connected to them. Another thing I love about the timeline grid is it really gives you your research status at a glance. So in a couple of different ways, when you see a blank column, you know you haven't found the family in that census, or you don't see any birth information, you know that you need to look for that. And then, of course, the to-do list, as we mentioned, you've got that just at the top of the list. So or the top of the document. So anytime you open up your timeline grid, you know exactly what you've got on your schedule for next steps. And then finally, one thing I love about the grid is it really has helped me improve accuracy. So I'll give you an example. So here I found my ancestor or cousin. I can't remember if he's an ancestor or cousin, but Edward Stuffin. And he's 27. He's working on the railway and he's married to Mary A. And in my head, I just always think it's Mary Ann. So there they are. They don't have any kids then yet. And then in the next census, I find him with his wife. And I think, oh, yeah, Annie, that's probably, I've seen other family members go by their middle name in a census and then their first name. So I'm really sure that this is Mary Ann. She's just going by Annie, and I don't give it too much more thought. And I write down the kids. And then I get to the 1911 census when I notice something that possibly some of you who are pretty sharper than I was at the time, noticed by looking at the timeline grid. I had just looked at the name, but what do you notice about the ages? We would have expected Mary A to be about 37 in the next census. Well, 42, that's kind of far off, but possibly, ages are wrong in censuses a lot. But moving to a completely different county or giving a completely different county as a birthplace, Mary A was born in Scott or Lincolnshire, and then Annie is in Longnon. I don't know if I'm saying that right, Staffordshire. So totally different county. And then not only that, when we get to the 1911, we see that Annie and Edward have only been married 12 years. So they got married about 1899. So there is no way these two women are the same. Well, the timeline grid, by having that information in front of me, enabled me to see what I could have missed if I had just been flipping screens and maybe didn't notice that the two women were born in different places, or didn't really pay attention to their ages, or didn't really stop to think about what it meant that they'd only been married 12 years in the 1911 census. So I updated the grid correctly, used the children's birth records to find the maiden names of the mothers, and found out that this Mary A was actually Mary A. Pickering. And this information was correct. She was born about 64 in Scotter, and then sadly she died. And Edward remarried to Annie Williamson, and then they did have additional children. So can you see how having that information right in front of me made it easier to catch the mistake that I had made? Whereas honestly, I really believe if I'd been flipping back and forth between screens and censuses, it would have been a lot less likely that I would have found the mistake that I had made. So you're probably asking, great, you've told me about a timeline grid. I think I'd like to try it. What do I do next? Where do I go from here? This is what I would recommend. First of all, choose a family to research using the timeline grid, and choose an easier one. Like, don't choose one with some strange brick wall on it that you've been struggling with for a long time. I would choose a family that, oh, well, for sure, you want to choose a family that is within a census period in a country, but choose one that looks to be fairly straightforward. Maybe you've already found them in a couple of censuses on, in historical records. And then decide which application you'd like to use, whether you'd like to do Google Drive, Evernote, Word, Excel, OpenOffice, OneNote. The sky's the limit, really. Any application that will let you create a table, you can use for a timeline grid. And then you can either create the grid yourself, or you can download a template, more on that in a second, and then find the information on the family, enter it into the grid, and then look at the grid and use it to extend your research or find more information. Or possibly, once you've gotten used to using the timeline grid, they actually are really helpful for breaking down brick walls. So, but I wouldn't probably start with a brick wall. I'd start with something simpler, and then once you're comfortable, use it for the more complicated uses. So timeline grid templates are available here on my website, goldenrodgenealogy.com. This is a totally free website. This is not a bait and switch. Not only are the timeline grids completely free, but all other materials on this site are free. I actually named it Goldenrod Genealogy because I think it's a cool name. It's got some cool symbolism. So you can actually go to this site and go to the About section and read a little bit about that if you want to. Versions are available for Google Drive, Word, and Excel. I don't have them in other applications yet, but if people felt strongly that they would like those, I would be happy to create new templates. Right now, we've only got them, I shouldn't say only, we have them for these countries: United States, British, which you can use for England and Wales. Ireland's a little more tricky because so many of their censuses were destroyed, but you still could adapt the timeline grid for Irish censuses. And then Canadian, let me give a shout out to my cousin Gordon, who created the timeline grids for Canada. So I really appreciate that. And these are all fully editable. So the templates themselves are not editable. What you need to do is go to the template, download a copy, and then you can edit your copy. But I haven't made the templates themselves editable because the templates need to work for everybody. So you copy the template and then you can change it to your heart's content. So, but by way of summary for today, the timeline grid helps you know your families. It helps you remember what you've found and what you're still trying to find, and it helps you improve accuracy. Also, collaborate with family and friends, and um, class materials and handout. The class materials handout, if I could just read, right? And the free templates can help you get started. So let me pop in the class materials link to the chat. And please feel free to go to that. You know what? I'm going to bring that up on the screen. So here, sorry, it was on the next slide. So if I click on this, this is the handout, and it's got links to the slide presentation. It's got links to the template, and it's got a link to the survey for this class. We'd love to get your feedback, both what you like so we can keep doing it and ways that you would like us to improve. And we take your feedback very seriously. Well, I've actually made quite a few changes to my presentations based on your very helpful feedback. So I think that's it for this. Sister Esplin, am I
I was going
hearing
to say,
you?
yes, you are.
Yeah.
A couple of things. Someone has said they are an Apple Mac user. Do you think you might be making a Pages version of this?
Oh, I don't know what Pages is.
It's the Apple form of Word,
Wonderful.
and
Do
you can export and convert. There's a conversion process from one to the other.
aha.
If you have access
Then
to a Mac.
fantastic. Then if anybody would like me to post Pages, I don't have a Mac, so I wouldn't be able to create those myself. But if somebody wants to create them and email me a copy, please feel free and I'll post them on the website. Because I would love to put in another request we've gotten, which I haven't been able to do yet, but which I'm planning to do, is somebody from England asked if we could do the paper size of A3 and A4. Right now, they're just in United States letter and legal. So that I am planning to do. So the more the merrier. I think the more templates we can get, the more people can find benefit by using the timeline grid.
Sounds
So
great.
that actually, let me pop my email address on the screen. If anybody would like, if you decide to create a template and you'd like to donate it to the cause, please just email it to me at this address and I'll get it put on the website. And I see we've got a question in the Q&A. Let's see. Mike says, do you ever make a timeline grid using census records and multiple other sources? Mike, that is such a good question. Let me pop back. The short answer is yes, but let me pop back and show you um, on one of our little examples here what I have done. Let's go back to a grid. Okay, so for instance, if a family emigrated from one country to another, I will often insert, like let's say that the 1911 isn't here, and that this family emigrated from England to Australia between 1910 and 1911, or 1901 and 1911. Then you know what, actually, that's a bad example because the 1911 census is not easily available in Australia. Let's just go with America. I was trying to be more global, but let's just go with America. So let's say that this family between 1901 and 1911 emigrated to the United States. So they're in the 1901 England census and they're in the 1910 US Census, but I want to capture the ship's manifest information. So I will insert a column between 1901 and 1910. And I'll have to tell you, I started to color it blue because I'm so used to the cadence, like that it's always 1891, 1901, 1911, or whatever, that I found when I put the ship's manifest in, I kept thinking it was a census. So I will insert the column, color it blue, and then list all the family members as they appear in the census. Excuse me, in the ship's manifest. So that's one example. So if there's a record that lists all the family members and it takes place at a certain point in time, I will create a new column at that point in time. So between the appropriate census columns. But if it's just one thing like a draft registration or a will, I will tend to put those things just in the first column, in the ID and vitals column. I actually used to put like death information in the cell after they died, and it was just too confusing because people die at different times. So Edward's death would be one place, Annie's death would be someplace else, Mary Ann's death would be a different place, Cecil, et cetera, et cetera. You see what I'm saying? So I'd have deaths scattered all over throughout the grid, and it was just like cluttered and hard to find. And so I found it was just a lot easier to enter anything with vital information. So I'll say B about 1864, D about 1920, military 1918, if it was in the First World War or whatever. So that's how I handle the different sources, Mike. I hope that is helpful to you. Any other questions, you guys?
Lots of great comments and feedback. Randall says Mac users can download in rich text format, but I've also been able to do a conversion. I'll see if I can convert a word to pages. There was a question in the Q&A earlier, and I just redirected it, but it was somebody wanting to show how to handle multiple relationships in Family Tree, and I said, you have just decided on May 22nd to do
Great.
a class on making sure the relationship is right in Family Tree. And so that will allow you to record step parents and remarriages and divorces and things like that.
Adoptions and whatever else. Yeah, it's not exactly intuitive, to be honest with you, in many cases. A standard nuclear family with parents and kids, that is pretty straightforward. But any of those cases that Sister Esplin just mentioned, multiple marriages and whatever else all, yeah, not always the most straightforward. And sometimes when the errors are there, it's like if people are joined to the wrong spouse or they've got the wrong kids, like we demonstrated in our last Boost webinar, it's not always straightforward how to sort those out. So yeah, on the 22nd, please join us for that webinar, because we'll go into detail about both creating correct relationships, even the complicated ones like adoptions or whatever, and also fixing problems in relationships that you may find in Family Tree. One of the most crazy ones is a loop. Have you guys ever seen that, where it's the I'm my own grandpa kind of thing, where you have a person and then their parent and then the person and then their parent and then the person? We'll talk about how to fix those too. So we're actually pretty good on time. There's another question in the Q&A. Let me just, oh, Marie says, will you be giving this class again? Yes, Marie, we actually rotate through this class. So if you've got through all of my classes, I just keep giving them over and over. So if you have suggestions for improvement, please do let me know, and I can implement them on the next class. But if you are also asking, Marie, because you thought, I'd really like to see this again because I'd like to, get it in my brain more, reinforcement of it or whatever, this class has been recorded and it will be posted on our archive page. And that is in the handout. Did I put it in the handout? Now I'm doubting myself. Is anybody?
It is in the document. It says you can see the recordings, and then there's a link back to it.
Okay, good. Sometimes if you guys ever do this, sometimes I think I did stuff and then I really didn't. So yeah, here is the link that will take you to the place where the recording will be posted. And the recordings usually take, I don't know, Sister Esplin, would you say 3 to 5 days to be
Yes, we're going to
posted?
try to get them posted by the end of Wednesday.
Okay.
But our web person is out of town and won't be back till early part of the week. So
Okay.
she's really good though.
Yeah, she'll get it up, I'm sure, as soon as she's back. So
I'm going to stop the recording. There are
okay,
a couple of other comments.
great.